The sun hung heavy in the sky, casting long shadows over the cotton fields as Jack's small hands worked the earth. His skin, darkened by the sun, was streaked with sweat and dust. He was just a boy, no more than 10 years old, but his fingers moved with the practiced rhythm of someone much older. His family's farm stretched far beyond what the eye could see, an endless sea of white tufts waving gently in the summer breeze. Jack's father, a tall, worn man with calloused hands, moved along the rows beside him, a slow but steady pace. His mother worked farther down the field, a silent figure with a straw hat pulled low to shield her face from the sun. Jack could hear her humming a soft tune as she worked, the only music that ever played in their world. He paused for a moment, wiping his brow with the back of his hand, his breath coming in slow, deliberate gasps. The fields were unyielding, and so were the long hours. Yet, even in the midst of the heat, Jack's thoughts wandered elsewhere. He closed his eyes for just a second, feeling the warmth on his face, but his mind drifted far from the cotton. He thought of the books he had borrowed from the small library in town, books about farming techniques, about science, about ways to make the land work for you instead of against you. At night, after the day's work was done, he would pore over those pages by the dim light of the kitchen lamp. The words filled him with a sense of something bigger, something beyond the endless rows of cotton. It was a dream that seemed so far away, like the sky that stretched above him, beautiful but distant. But Jack had always been a dreamer, even when life seemed to offer little but hard labor and struggle. He couldn't help it. He longed for something different. He wanted to make a difference, not just in his life, but in the lives of the people around him. His people. The farmers, the workers, the ones who toiled every day for a meager living. They deserved more. Jack was determined to find a way to help them. His father's voice broke through his thoughts. "Jack," he called, "get back to work. You don't want to miss the sunset. We need to finish before it gets dark." Jack nodded and bent down to pick another tuft of cotton, but as his hands moved through the soft fibers, his heart stirred with a quiet resolve. Someday, he would find a way out. The library smelled of old paper and pine wood, a scent that Jack had come to cherish. It was a modest building, tucked between two storefronts on Main Street. The shelves, though small and crowded, were filled with worlds far beyond the one Jack knew. Every time he entered, he felt a quiet excitement stir in his chest, an excitement that had little to do with the heat of the outside world or the work awaiting him at home. Jack's shoes shuffled against the wooden floor as he wandered past rows of books. He liked to arrive just before closing time, when the library was nearly empty, giving him space to get lost in the words. His fingers ran lightly over the spines of books, feeling the rough textures and imagining the stories within. He'd already read most of the books in the fiction section, but what really caught his attention now were the ones about farming, agriculture, science, technology. These were words that fascinated him more than anything else. He found a book on crop rotation and pulled it from the shelf. He skimmed the pages with intensity, absorbing every bit of information he could. Jack had no formal training, no classroom, no teachers. But he had something else, a hunger to learn, an insatiable curiosity. Behind the counter, Mrs. Parker, the librarian, watched him with a quiet smile. She had noticed Jack's frequent visits and knew his family's situation. Most kids his age were out playing or helping at home, but Jack was always here, seeking knowledge. "You know," Mrs. Parker said as she tidied the counter, "there's a whole world out there beyond these fields." Jack looked up, surprised by the words, as if they had been meant just for him. She smiled again, her eyes soft with understanding. "Keep reading, Jack. You never know where it might take you." He nodded, his heart quickening. He had never shared his dreams with anyone, but in that moment, he felt like someone, at least one person, believed in him. The sun had set, and the evening air was thick with humidity. Jack sat at the kitchen table, his elbows resting on the worn wood, his fingers idly tracing the grain of the table's surface. His mother was washing dishes at the sink, and his father sat in the corner, his boots propped up on the chair next to him, flipping through the pages of a tattered newspaper. The silence between them was familiar, a comfort even. The kitchen was small, the walls lined with family photos and old kitchen utensils. Despite the hard work and the long hours, this was where Jack found solace. But tonight, there was something heavier in the air. His father had been quieter than usual. Jack could tell something was on his mind. "Pa," Jack said, his voice steady but unsure. "I've been thinking about college." His father looked up from the paper, his eyes narrowing slightly. Jack wasn't sure if it was surprise or concern in his eyes. "You know we can't afford that," his father said, his voice rough. "You've got work here. This land needs you." "I know," Jack replied quietly. "But I think there's a way to help more than just here. If I could learn more, maybe I could." "Learn more?" his father interrupted, his voice soft but firm. "Jack, you're a good boy. You work hard. You don't need no fancy schooling to make a living." Jack's heart dropped. He understood his father's worries. There wasn't much hope in their world, and Jack had seen how hard his parents worked just to get by. The bills piled up, the land didn't always yield what they needed, and dreams seemed too big for people like them. Jack's father, though proud, often wore the weight of reality on his shoulders. But Jack wasn't ready to give up. He lowered his gaze, his mind filled with thoughts of the books, the science, and the possibilities that could change everything. "I'll find a way," Jack muttered under his breath. His father gave him a long look, then nodded slowly. "I reckon you will, son. Just don't forget where you come from." Jack smiled, though the weight of his father's words sat heavy in his chest. He would do what he had to. For himself. For them. For the land. The gymnasium echoed with applause as the class of 1992 filed onto the stage in their caps and gowns, the air thick with the scent of freshly printed diplomas. Jack stood among them, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hardly believe the moment was real. Graduation, the culmination of years of late-night studying, hard work, and sacrifice, was finally here. But amidst the applause, Jack felt a quiet, gnawing uncertainty. What now? His parents sat in the audience, their faces proud but weary. His mother's hands clutched the edges of her dress tightly, and his father, though silent, gave him an encouraging nod. Jack could see the hope in their eyes. It was the same hope that had always been there, the kind that lived on the edge of their hard lives, the hope that their son might escape the fields. As Jack took his place on stage to receive his diploma, the principal, Mr. Reynolds, announced the scholarship awards. He called out names, students bound for universities in the state, on athletic scholarships or merit-based awards. Jack didn't expect to hear his name, but when the principal's voice rang out, "Jack Marshall, full scholarship to the University of Agriculture," time seemed to stop. The room seemed to blur around him. For a moment, Jack stood frozen, unsure if he'd heard it right. Then he felt a rush of warmth spread through him, the realization settling like a gentle weight. The applause around him grew louder. His parents leapt to their feet, clapping and shouting. His father's face lit up in disbelief, and his mother's tears glistened in the dim light. Jack walked slowly to the podium, his hands shaking slightly as he took the scholarship certificate. He barely heard the words the principal spoke next, too lost in the overwhelming surge of emotion. For the first time in his life, Jack felt that maybe, just maybe, he could change everything. He could leave the fields behind and build something different. The campus of the University of Agriculture was a world apart from the small town Jack had known. The buildings were large and intimidating, their walls made of brick and glass, not weathered wood. Students walked with purpose, their heads buried in books or deep in conversation, as Jack navigated the bustling pathways, feeling like an outsider. He stood in the center of the campus, unsure of where to go, feeling smaller than he ever had before. The city noises overwhelmed him, cars honking, people laughing, the constant hum of activity. Back home, the sounds had been simpler, the rustling of cotton in the wind, the creaking of the barn door, the faraway calls of cicadas. Here, everything felt foreign. The classroom was no different. Jack took his seat at the back, trying to blend in, his hands gripping the edges of the desk. The professor, a tall man with a booming voice, began talking about agricultural innovations, but Jack couldn't keep up. The words sounded so distant, things like genomic sequencing and genetic modification felt like a language from another world. He tried to focus, but the faces of his classmates distracted him. They were all so polished, so confident. They had lived in this world all their lives. They laughed and joked about their weekend plans, their trips to the mall, their families. Jack couldn't relate. He had never seen the inside of a mall, let alone gone on a weekend trip. During the first break, Jack sat alone on a bench under a tree, his mind racing. He missed his family. He missed the land. And he wondered if he really belonged here, among all these people who seemed to know so much. But then he remembered the scholarship. He remembered the promise he'd made to himself, and to his parents. He wasn't here to fit in. He was here to learn, to change his life, to change the lives of people like his family. Jack pushed his doubts aside, wiped the sweat from his palms, and made a silent vow. No matter how hard it got, he would succeed. For them. Months passed, and Jack threw himself into his studies, determined to prove he belonged. It wasn't easy. The work was difficult, the concepts abstract, and the experiments often failed. But Jack didn't back down. He spent late nights in the research lab, his hands stained with the ink of scientific journals, his mind buzzing with calculations and ideas. Finally, after a long stretch of trials and errors, something clicked. Jack's research had focused on improving the yield and resilience of rice crops, specifically, how to create a variety that could thrive in unpredictable conditions and resist pests that had long plagued southern farmers. His fingers flew across the lab notebook as he scribbled the results of his latest experiment. The hybrid rice he had bred had not only increased in yield but had also shown impressive resistance to disease. His heart pounded in his chest as he repeated the tests, double-checking his findings. Could it really be? Could he have done it? Jack rushed to his professor's office, holding the research notes tightly in his hands. Professor Dalton, a gruff but kind man, looked up from his desk as Jack entered, eyes wide with excitement. "Professor, I think I've found it," Jack said, nearly breathless. "I think I bred a new rice variety." Professor Dalton glanced at the notes, and then back at Jack, his expression unreadable. There was a long pause before he leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady and thoughtful. "This is impressive," he said finally. "Jack, you may have just made a breakthrough." Jack felt a wave of relief wash over him. This was what he had been working toward all these years, the reason he'd pushed through all the doubts and the struggles. This discovery could change everything for farmers like his family, farmers who had been fighting a losing battle for generations. As he walked out of the professor's office, Jack's heart swelled with pride. He had done it. And now, he was one step closer to the dream that had taken root in his heart so many years ago. The bus ride home was long, and the landscape outside the window seemed to shift with every mile. Jack had changed in the years since he left. His clothes were more refined, his posture more confident, but the dirt roads of his hometown still felt like home. The sun hung low in the sky as the bus pulled into the small town station, and Jack's heart beat faster as he stepped off the pavement and onto familiar soil. His parents were waiting for him by the old oak tree near the station. His father's broad shoulders still held the same stoic strength, but his mother's smile had grown even warmer, if that was possible. They embraced, Jack feeling their love like a weight on his chest, a constant reminder of why he'd worked so hard. They drove back to the house, where the land stretched out before them, rows of cotton that now seemed smaller to Jack, even though they stretched farther than the eye could see. His parents had not changed much, the weight of years and struggle still evident in their faces, but Jack could see the hope in their eyes as they approached the house. "Pa," Jack said, his voice firm, "I've got something to show you." They walked out to the fields, Jack leading the way. As they stood in the cool evening air, Jack pulled out the packet of seeds he had brought with him from the university. He had already planted a few rows in the corner of their land, just enough to test the new rice variety. His father watched with quiet interest. "Is this it?" his father asked, his voice uncertain but curious. "This is it," Jack said, a slight tremor in his voice. "I've worked hard for this. It'll help the soil, help the yield, and protect the crops from pests. It's the future." Jack's father nodded slowly, his brow furrowed but his eyes flickering with cautious hope. "I trust you, son. Let's see what it can do." The sun had risen early that morning, casting a golden glow over the fields as Jack and his father walked through the rows of rice. The air smelled of earth and growth, the soft rustling of rice stalks the only sound except for their footsteps. Jack felt a surge of pride as he watched the crops sway in the breeze. The rice he had bred was flourishing. His father paused beside him, running his fingers through the golden stalks. "Looks good, son. Real good." It wasn't just the rice itself, it was the way the whole field had changed. The plants were stronger, healthier. Jack had used a more efficient irrigation system alongside his new rice strain, and it had worked. No sign of pests or diseases. This was the harvest his parents had always hoped for. The years of hard work, the endless struggle against crop failures, the worry about not having enough to make it through the year, all of that was starting to melt away. The local farmers, who had come to watch Jack's experiment with skepticism, were now starting to gather around. Word had spread about the success of the new crop, and the people who had once doubted Jack's ability to bring change were now seeing it with their own eyes. "Jack!" one of the farmers, old Mr. Wallace, called from the edge of the field. This could change everything for us." Jack smiled, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. "It's just the beginning," he said. "We've got more work to do. But this is how we start." The group gathered around, inspecting the plants and talking about the possibilities. For the first time, Jack felt like he was part of something bigger than himself, something that could truly transform his community. His father patted him on the back, his rough hand warm against Jack's shoulder. "You've done good, son. You've done real good." As Jack stood in the middle of the fields, watching the town celebrate its newfound hope, he reflected on everything that had brought him to this moment. The cotton fields, once a symbol of endless labor and struggle, now felt like the foundation for something new. It was a future he had built with his own hands, through determination, education, and a willingness to dream beyond the boundaries of his upbringing. The townspeople were already making plans for next season, discussing how they could expand the use of the new rice strain. The fields were alive with possibility, not just for Jack, but for everyone who had ever worked these lands. His mind raced with ideas for new projects, new ways to help the community thrive. The possibilities seemed endless. He could see his parents in the distance, walking through the fields hand in hand. They were proud, but there was also a sense of peace in their steps, a relief that Jack had found his way, and with it, had brought hope to their world. Jack knew that this was just the beginning. There was more to do, more to learn, and more lives to change. But standing there, amidst the fields, Jack felt certain of one thing: his roots would always guide him. And the future, shaped by his work, would be brighter than any past he could remember.